All right, strap in everyone, because today we are going to be taking a deep dive into the Mad Max video game. You know, our amazing listener sent in this really detailed YouTube script
Yeah.
as a suggestion for this episode. And honestly, looking it over, it's got me pretty hyped to jump in and explore why this game, why Mad Max, seems to have kind of flown under the radar for so
Okay.
many. Looking at the script, it's more than just a typical review, right? It's almost like we're digging up this hidden gem together and trying to figure out why exactly it clicks with certain players. One of the first things that jumps out to me just from reading this is how much depth there is to the story, especially for a game that I think a lot of people would initially see and think, okay, this is just a fun action explosion-filled kind of game.
Yeah, definitely. I see where you're coming from with that. I think it would have been really easy for them to just lean into that aspect, just the car combat, the explosions, all that. But the game actually goes a lot deeper than that. I mean, the way it expands on the Mad Max universe is really interesting.
Absolutely. And it's funny you should mention the car combat because, of course, we have to talk about the magnum opus.
Uh,
Come on, who doesn't love a fully customizable death machine on wheels?
yeah.
And the script even mentions, spikes, flamethrowers, harpoons. It's really not just about getting from point A to point B in this wasteland. It's about making a statement.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that because I think that really ties into Max as a character. This is a man who has lost literally everything. His entire world is in ruins. And yet he finds a way to take control,
Yeah.
to create something unique and powerful in the face of all this chaos. It's like almost a form of self-expression.
Totally. It's like building your own little fortress in a world that's constantly trying to break you down.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, when you played the game, did you find yourself gravitating towards any particular build? Were you all about offense, or did you maybe try to go for a more strategic approach?
Well, if I'm going to be honest, I kind of went a little overboard with the offensive mods. I mean, come on, there's just something so satisfying about watching an enemy vehicle erupt in flames after you hit it with a spiked grill.
Oh, absolutely.
But you're right, though, it's not always just about brute force. There's a surprising amount of strategy that's involved in building the magnum opus, especially when you factor in all the different enemy types and the different environments you'll be in.
Yeah, and the environments themselves. I mean, the wasteland is a character in itself, wouldn't you say? It's not just an empty backdrop. It's alive, it's dangerous, it's even beautiful at times. And reading through the script, I was thinking about these dynamic sandstorms that are mentioned. I bet those must be super intense to play through.
Oh, they totally are.
Yeah.
It really adds a whole other dimension to the gameplay. You can be driving along thinking you've got everything under control, and then suddenly, bam, you're caught in this blinding, crazy storm. It's a fantastic way to create tension and keep the players on edge. But at the same time, it's just such a visual spectacle, like the way the light shines through the sand as it's swirling around. It's almost poetic in a way.
And speaking of poetry, the script mentions that there's some surprising emotional depth to this game. And I was particularly intrigued by Chumbucket, Max's mechanic. He almost seems to represent this glimmer of hope and faith in this otherwise, desolate world.
Yeah, for sure. Chumbucket's like religious devotion to the magnum opus is really fascinating. It's almost like he sees the car as more than just a machine. It's the symbol of salvation, like a way to transcend the realities of living in the wasteland. And his dynamic with Max, who has pretty much lost faith in everything, it's really compelling. It's like this reminder that even in the darkest of times, human connection can still find a way.
It sounds like the writers really put some thought into all the characters. They didn't just throw in a bunch of random archetypes just to populate the world. You really get the sense that every character has been touched by the wasteland.
For sure, for sure. It's like every encounter, every conversation has all this backstory baked into it. You can see the scars on their faces, you can hear it in their voices. It makes the whole thing feel so much more real.
And that leads perfectly into my next question.
Yeah.
How does the game handle the connection to the Mad Max movies? Does it feel like a cheap cash grab, or does it actually stand on its own 2 feet while still honoring the source material? Because from what I've gathered from the script, it really seems like the creators understood the essence of Mad Max.
Yeah, I'd say they absolutely nailed it. They didn't try to force a direct adaptation or anything like that. Instead, they created this story that feels really authentic to the spirit of Mad Max while expanding on the world in new and exciting ways.
So it's not just some fan servicey retread. It's like a legitimate entry in the Mad Max canon.
Yeah.
That's awesome, especially for someone like me who really loves those films. And it makes me wonder if maybe there's a different way we can think about the game's release date and that underrated status that always comes up.
That's an interesting thought. The timing of its release definitely could have played a role in how it's been perceived over time.
Yeah, because speaking of that, like, I mean, it's funny how we say underrated, but looking at the script, reviews at the time of its release were actually pretty positive, right? So what gives? Why does this game seem to have slipped through the cracks for so many people?
Well, I think it's important to remember that 2015 was a huge year for gaming. Like you had The Witcher 3, Metal Gear Solid 5, Fallout 4. Mad Max had to compete with some real heavy hitters for people's attention.
It's like trying to release an indie film on the same weekend as the next Marvel movie, right?
Exactly.
But what really stands out to me is that even with all that competition, this game still has such a dedicated fan base.
Right.
So there's something about it that really resonates with people, even if it wasn't a massive mainstream hit.
I think a big part of that is that Mad Max doesn't try to be all things to all people, you know? It knows exactly what it is and it totally commits to that. Like at its core, it's a game about survival. It's about scavenging and scraping by in this brutal world. And for a lot of players, I think that's the exact kind of immersive experience they're looking for.
And it's funny you should say that because one thing that the script mentions is the hand-to-hand combat. And it talks about how some people felt like it was too similar to the Batman Arkham games. But honestly, is that necessarily a bad thing? I mean, if the combat system is fun and it fits the game thematically, does it really matter if it's not reinventing the wheel?
Hmm. That's a great point. I think there's definitely a difference between taking inspiration from a well-established system versus just straight up copying it.
Mhm.
And in the case of Mad Max, the combat really feels like it belongs in this world. It's
Yeah.
brutal, it's visceral, and it really makes you feel like you're in Max's shoes. You know, you're not some superhero, you're just a dude trying to survive.
Yeah, exactly. Every punch, every takedown, it all feels like a struggle. It's not about pulling off flashy combos. It's about just staying alive.
Mm.
And that sense of desperation really comes across in the gameplay.
Oh, absolutely. I think the game does a fantastic job of making that threat feel real. You're never truly safe out in the wasteland. Even when you clear an area, there's always this feeling that something could pop out at any moment and take you down.
It all comes back to the wasteland itself, doesn't it? The script describes it as gigantic, merciless, and eerily beautiful. And it mentions these dynamic sandstorms that add a whole new layer of challenge. When you played, did you find that the world was almost like a memorable character in itself?
Absolutely, 100%. It's so much more than just a backdrop for the action. The environmental storytelling is amazing. Every single ruin, every rusted vehicle, every bone you see just scattered around, they all tell a story. It's like you can feel the weight of everything that's happened there.
And I can only imagine that those sandstorms just add to that feeling, right?
Yeah.
Like nature itself is against you.
Exactly. They create this incredible sense of tension and claustrophobia. You can barely see. The wind is howling all around you. It's an overload of the senses.
But even in all of that chaos and desolation, you still have those little moments of beauty, like the way the light comes through the dust or just the vastness of the desert under a night sky.
You're so right. There is this strange, almost desolate beauty to the wasteland. It's haunting, but it's also kind of captivating.
And I think that's one of the things that makes this game so interesting. It's not just about the action and explosions and car chases. It's about exploring the human condition against all odds.
Yeah.
It's about finding those little glimmers of hope and humanity in a world that's basically gone insane. And I think that's why this game has resonated with so many players for so long.
I completely agree. It's a game that really sticks with you. It makes you think about the choices you'd make in that kind of situation. What would you be willing to do to survive, you know?
And what kind of magnum opus would you build?
Oh, definitely right. That's part of the fun.
Totally. I mean, imagine what your own personal war machine would look like, you know?
Yeah, that's actually a great point.
It's like a reflection of you, of your personality.
It is. It's like a form of self-expression.
Totally. And, speaking of self-expression, the script mentions Max and his, quote, glimmer of hope for redemption. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on his character arc throughout the game. Does he feel like a fully fleshed out character, or is he just a typical action hero?
Oh, he's definitely more than just a generic action hero. The writers did a great job of showing his inner struggles, his guilt, his grief over all that he's lost. He's haunted by his past, but he's still trying to move on. He's trying to atone for his past, you know?
So there's this real emotional core to him. It's not all just about being tough and blowing things up.
Exactly. He's a complex character, and I think that's what makes him so interesting. Like, you want to see him succeed, even though you know he's probably going to mess things up along the way.
He's flawed, but he's relatable. And I think that makes him a great protagonist for a story like this.
Yeah, that vulnerability, that human element is what makes him so much more interesting.
And speaking of interesting characters, we've talked about Chum Bucket, but the script hints at a whole cast of colorful personalities that populate the wasteland. Did any of those stand out to you in particular?
Oh man, there are so many memorable characters, but one that comes to mind is Jeet. He's this grizzled old warrior who's seen it all. He has this gruff, no-nonsense attitude that I just love.
Oh, he sounds like someone you wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of.
Definitely not.
Mhm.
But he's also got this heart of gold, and he's fiercely loyal to those he trusts. He's like this walking embodiment of an old school code of honor that still survives in the wasteland.
That's so interesting. So even in this world where everything has gone to hell, there are still these little pockets of humanity, these people who still hold on to their values.
Exactly. It's like they're trying to hold on to the last pieces of civilization, and in a way that makes them even more heroic than Max. They're not just fighting to survive, they're fighting for something bigger than themselves.
It's like that whole idea of finding meaning in chaos, right? It's what separates Mad Max from a lot of other post-apocalyptic stories. It's not just about the violence and the despair. It's about the strength of the human spirit.
Exactly, exactly. It's about finding ways to survive, rebuild, create something new from the ashes. And that's such a powerful message, especially in times like these.
It's about finding hope in the darkness, finding those moments of beauty and connection that remind us why we keep fighting. And sometimes those moments come from the most unexpected places. Who would have thought that a game about a lone warrior driving through the wasteland could offer such a deep reflection on what it means to be human?
Right. It really shows the power of video games as a storytelling medium and their ability to explore complex ideas in ways that other mediums can't. It's about creating an experience that stays with you long after you're done.
And speaking of experiences that stay with you, let's talk about the ending of this game. Without giving too much away, the script mentions that Max is searching for the Plains of Silence, this mythical place where he hopes to find some peace. Did you find that ending satisfying? Did it feel earned?
I think the ending is absolutely brilliant. It's open to interpretation, but it definitely leaves you with this sense of hope. Like a feeling that maybe after everything Max has been through, maybe he can finally find some peace. It's not a typical Hollywood ending, all tied up neatly. It's more nuanced, more realistic, which makes it even more powerful.
It's almost like the wasteland itself, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's harsh and unforgiving, but there's still so much possibility.
Yeah.
It's like realizing that the journey is just as important as the destination, that even when everything seems stacked against you, there's still something worth fighting for.
Absolutely. And sometimes the fight itself is what gives life meaning.
I love that. And, it ties back to what we were talking about earlier, how the wasteland shapes the people who live there. It's not just about surviving, it's about thriving, finding a way to make your mark on a world that's constantly trying to wipe you out.
I agree. That's what makes Mad Max such a great game. It's not just empty spectacle and action. It's something way deeper. It's about the struggle to survive, to find hope, to find meaning in a world gone mad. And ultimately, it's about how the choices we make define who we are.
And you know what? Speaking of choices, one of the choices that I think people should make is to give Mad Max a try. If you're looking for a game that's going to challenge you, that's going to stick with you, that's going to make you see the world differently, this is it.
I'm with you there, definitely. You might just be surprised by what you find.
You might just fall in love with the wasteland. Who knows? You might even find a piece of yourself out there in the dust and the grit.
You never know.
And I think that's a perfect place to wrap things up for part one. But don't worry, we'll be back with part two very soon, so stay tuned. Welcome back, everyone, to part two of our deep dive into Mad Max. So before the break, we were talking about how the wasteland is almost like a character itself in this game. And I want to pick up on that because it's more than just the look of the place, right? It's about how the environment actually shapes the people who live in it. It shapes their beliefs, their values, everything.
Yeah, totally. The wasteland is definitely more than just a setting. It's this force that constantly pushes people to their limits and forces them to make really tough choices. It strips away all the BS and shows you what really matters.
I think that's a big part of why the Mad Max universe has been so fascinating for so long. It's like holding up a mirror to our own society and making us question what we value, what we'd fight for if everything was taken away.
Yeah, it's like a constant reminder that civilization is fragile. It can all disappear in an instant. And when it does, the things we take for granted, things like law and order and compassion, they can vanish just like that.
It's a pretty sobering thought for sure. But there's also a message of hope in there too, right? The Mad Max story is about the resilience of the human spirit, that ability to find meaning and connection even when everything is going wrong.
Oh, absolutely. It's about surviving, rebuilding, creating something new out of the destruction. And I think that message is something that resonates with everyone, especially during times of uncertainty and change.
It's about finding that little glimmer of hope in the darkness. Those moments of beauty and connection that remind us why we keep going. And sometimes those moments come from the most random places. Like, who would have thought that a video game about a guy driving a souped-up car through a wasteland could have such a profound message?
Right. I think it shows the power of storytelling, especially in video games. They can explore these complex themes in a way that no other medium can.
And, speaking of experiences that stay with you, let's talk about the ending of the game. Without giving anything away, the script mentions Max's search for the Plains of Silence, this mythical place where he hopes to find some peace. Did you think the ending was satisfying? Did it feel like a natural conclusion to everything?
I thought the ending was perfect. I mean, it's open to interpretation, but it definitely leaves you with a sense of hope. Like, even after everything Max has been through, he might actually find some peace. It's not your typical happy ending. It's way more nuanced and realistic, which makes it more impactful.
It's kind of like the wasteland itself, isn't it?
Yeah,
Harsh and unforgiving, but still full of possibility.
exactly.
It's about understanding that the journey is just as important as the destination, and that even when the odds are stacked against you, there's always something worth fighting for.
And sometimes the fight is what gives life meaning.
I love that. It goes back to what we were saying before, how the wasteland shapes everyone. It's not just surviving, it's about finding a way to thrive, to make your mark on a world that wants to erase you.
I agree. That's what makes Mad Max such a great game. It's more than just action and explosions. It's about something much bigger. It's about survival, hope, finding meaning in a world that's lost its way. And in the end, it's about how our choices define who we are.
So if you're looking for a game that'll challenge you, that'll make you think, that'll stay with you long after you're done playing, Mad Max is worth checking out.
For sure, you might be surprised by what you discover.
You might find yourself loving the wasteland. Who knows? You might even find a part of yourself out there. Okay, so that's going to do it for part 2 of our Mad Max deep dive. But don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with part 3 after a quick break. Welcome back, everyone, to the final part of our Mad Max deep dive. Now, before the break, we were talking about that idea of the wasteland as a character. And I keep thinking about that. We've talked about how it looks, the sandstorms, all the ruins and stuff. But it's got to be more than just that, right? It's about how it changes the people who live there.
Yeah, for sure. It's like this force, like we were saying, that shapes everything. It pushes everyone to their limits. It makes them make choices they never thought they'd have to make. It peels back all the layers and shows you what's at the core of someone?
And that's why I think Mad Max is so fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
It makes us look at ourselves, at our own world,
Yeah.
and ask ourselves, what do we really value? What would we fight for if everything was taken away?
Exactly. Like, it's scary to think about, but it makes you realize that what we have now isn't guaranteed.
Yeah, it's definitely a sobering thought. But even with all of that, there's still hope in the Mad Max story. It's about how strong the human spirit can be,
For sure.
about how we can find meaning and connect with each other, even in the craziest situations.
Right. It's about finding a way to survive and rebuild, to create something good out of all the bad.
It's about finding those moments of hope, no matter how small they are. Those connections that remind us why we keep fighting. And sometimes, like we were saying, those moments can come out of nowhere. Like, who would have thought that a game about driving a tricked-out car through a wasteland could be so deep?
It's true, though, isn't it? I think it just shows how powerful stories can be, especially in video games.
Speaking of stories, we have to talk about how the game ends. Now, I don't want to spoil anything for anyone who hasn't played, but the script mentions Max is looking for something called the Plains of Silence. Supposedly, it's this place where he can finally be at peace. When you finished the game, did that ending feel right to you?
Honestly, I thought it was brilliant. It doesn't spell everything out for you, which I liked, but it leaves you with a feeling of hope. Like, after everything Max has been through, maybe he can finally find some peace. It's not a perfect happy ending. It's more realistic. And because of that, it hits a lot harder.
It's almost like the wasteland itself, isn't it? Tough and unforgiving, but still full of possibility.
Yeah, exactly.
It's about realizing that the journey matters just as much as the destination. And that even when things seem impossible, there's always something worth fighting for.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes that fight is what makes everything worth it.
That's such a good point. It all comes back to how the wasteland changes everyone, doesn't it? It's not just about surviving, it's about finding a way to thrive, to
Exactly.
leave your mark on a world that wants to erase you.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Mad Max is more than just a game. It's about something much bigger. It's about survival, finding hope, and figuring out what it means to be human when everything has gone wrong.
And sometimes I think that's what we all need,
A reminder that even when things are tough, we can find a way through it, and maybe even find ourselves along the way. So if you're looking for a game that will stay with you, one that'll make you think and see the world differently, I think Mad Max is definitely worth checking out.
Absolutely.
All right, everyone, that is going to wrap things up for our Mad Max deep dive. Thank you all so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time.